Welcome back to part 2 of our series where we are exploring the topic of mail merge inside of Word VBA. In our previous video, we focused primarily on connecting to a data source using Word VBA, and our data source in that example was simply an Excel file that had a very small data set, just a few rows of data. And now that we have successfully created a connection to that data source, we are now going to talk a little bit more about the things we can do with that data source. And additionally, we will also discuss a little bit about the properties and some of the, I would say, the finer objects that exist in the broader topic of a data source. Now, there's a lot that can kind of go wrong with this. I'm not going to say go wrong as in the code's not going to work as you behave, but more of a, there's things that IntelliSense won't work properly sometimes. And then there's also this one method that seems to cause a bug every once in a while. I've only had it happen once so far, but I do want to point out those topics for those of you who do plan to do this in a little bit more detail. So in this next subroutine, what we are going to do is we're going to say working with our data source. Perfect. Just like the previous one, we're going to define some variables, but guess what? We already have a lot of those variables defined. So we're going to just take advantage of that. And then we're going to also just save ourselves some time, and we'll take some code that we already have. Additionally, we are going to declare some mail merge specific variables. So declare mail merge specific variables. Technically, the one at the top is Word mail merge field. So a field is basically an individual data field inside of your mail merge data source. Now, you're going to see a bunch of different fields, okay? So you're going to have data fields, you're going to have just a field, you're going to have, field names. Each one of them is a little bit different. So this is the actual name of your field. The data field is basically the data value that would be found in your name field. And then your fields is technically what you see in your document. So if you were to add a field in your document, that's considered a field object. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine I go to mailings and I go and say, hey, I want to add the company name somewhere in this template that we're going to be creating, right? Well, that's the whole benefit of mail merge. You can specify a field and say, hey, wherever you see this field, I want you to insert that particular row value. So for example, if I go to insert merge field, I can see the different field names from my particular data source. So say I want to put last name here. So it puts it in these two little, arrows or directional arrows. I don't know. This is considered a field object inside of Word VBA. So this is a field object. The collection of them is the fields, right? So the fields collection, and then you have a field name, right? So what is the name of this field? This represents the amount. So the name of the field is the amount field. And then you're going to have data values inside of this. That's considered the data field. So each of the ones that would be popping up. So if I want to preview my results, technically this would be considered the data field. This is the data field. This is the data field, and so on and so on. Very important that you recognize that. You notice here, I'm going all through them. Different things, right? We'll go through more of this obviously once we get there, but I just want to make sure you understand the difference between the fields. There's multiple field objects, but each one of them is a little bit different. So the first one is the data field. We're going to also work with the collection a little bit more for just looping purposes, but again, I want to show you if you want to define that variable, it's the fields collection. And really, this is the same thing, but we're going to be doing the field name. Field name, field names. And And then we're going to have mail merge field names. And then field name, just like that. And just for consistency, I will move this down because it will bother me if I don't have it with the other groups. We're not going to do the field one specific yet. That's when we actually create our template, and then we'll talk about that in more detail. Okay, so here's the bug. Dim word mail merge source, okay? And then you go, okay, so I see mail merge data source. Oh, okay, great. So it's just an object, right? Oh, if only. This is the error you're going to get. Compile error. A module is not a valid type. So apparently it's seeing this as its own module. There could be many reasons for that. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't see it basically specified here, so I didn't see it, but this seems to be an IntelliSense bug. So it will not let you define this particular one for you. So this will not work. You cannot, it looks like at this point, define that object type. If somebody finds a solution to that, please share it, because I haven't found one yet, and I don't know why it's happening. Everything else seemed to work fine, so I was really surprised that this one was giving me such a problem, but it is what it is. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about that error, let's actually work with our data source a little bit. So if you want some help a little bit, at least from IntelliSense perspective, there is a way around this. So in this situation, let's print some details about our data source. God, if I can type today. We're going to say with word mail merge dot data source. If you use it, if you wrap it in a with statement, IntelliSense works, and so you'll get some help. Now, all I'm really doing here is I'm going to print some properties about our particular data set. So I already have that code ready to go. What I'm going to do is I'm simply going to copy it over here and just talk a little bit through about the different properties that we're going to at least specifically talk about. So in this situation, I'm just going to print some details. So obviously our data source has a name. That name in our situation was simply the Excel workbook name. Additionally, we have a connection string. We built that in the previous video. So these are both properties that you can return if you wanted to. You also have a query string. So what is the query that you are using to select your data? That's simply the SQL statement. There's also a table name. This looks identical to the query string. I thought it would simply have the table name, but it doesn't seem to. So it looks like these two, at least for our Excel data source, seem to be the same. It might be different in other data sources. It might actually be different, but at this point, they seem to appear to be the same. You can also grab some information about your data source in the form of the number of records. So how many actual rows of data do you have? And then if you want to know the active record that you are currently on, so that's the record that I would say if you wanted like a visual comparison, like right here, this is the record that you're currently on. But you could put it on 2 if you wanted to, right? You could do that. But let's try that out in a second and see if we change that, if that changes that actual property. This is also not just a read-only property. You can actually set that property as well if you want to. Now, there are some other things you can do with it. So you can close your data source. You can see the field names, the first record, the header source name, invalid address, invalid comments, some other stuff as well, the type, map data fields, the last record, and so on and so on. So some of those are just more specific to kind of the problem that you're working with. But if you want some just more documentation aspect, just to kind of give you some information out there, by all means, I would highly recommend you look at the documentation provided by Microsoft. Now, if you go here, I think we can talk about our little data source object. That's interesting. I want to see something really quickly. Oh no, it's the same. I thought it was different casing, but it doesn't look like it is. But you can see here returns the active record. This is the first record. And so in this situation, these are simply returning the index, nothing crazy. You can also see here, this is an example. So this is not necessarily like returning the entire row. It's simply returning the number. It's nothing beyond that if you were thinking about it. And then looks like some other stuff too is you can send to printer. I guess you can print them if you want to. Interesting. That'd be something interesting to see. So let's print out this information and see what we get. I should probably open up my immediate window. That would be helpful. Okay, perfect. So you can see that the data source is simply the file path in this example. The connection string is this big old mess. We all love working with connection strings. That there seems to be more. There seems to be a lot more than what we had in ours when we had to define it. Interesting. That's odd. Look at this. So it looks like when, at least I would say when Word VBA records it, it looks like it cuts it off. There seems to be a tremendous amount of information that was cut off. Wow, that's interesting. Huh. It seems like it's all just related to the properties, though. That's really interesting. I wonder if there's a way if you could create the connection. There might be. Because you know how, like, with the record set library, the ADODB, I think that's the one, you can actually define the properties of your connection string. I'd be curious to see if maybe there's a connection string object or maybe like a connection object inside of Word that would maybe allow you to specify more of those attributes. I'm just shocked that this didn't result in it failing, because it clearly looks like it's cut off. I mean, it looks like it's cut off if I had to guess. I mean, that to me looks like it's cut off. So I'm shocked that it was working, but I guess it can. So, okay. Let's change this and let's see if that changes our little property here about our active record. I'm kind of curious to see what that does for us. Yeah, so that looks like it does change the active record. So this is tied to the ribbon. So if you change it here, you're going to see that change reflected inside of VBA as well. And you can also see, like I was saying, that the query string and the table name seem to be identical. There doesn't seem to be any difference between those two, at least for an Excel workbook data source. It might be different when it comes to a different data source. But I think even in the documentation, they said this returns the SQL statement. So I don't know why they have two different properties, but they're returning the same thing. But you can see here we have 3 rows, and then this is our current active record. Now, something you can do with a data source is you can actually try to find a record that contains a certain text that is inside of a particular field. So if you want, you can find a specific record. I will warn you right now, this seems to have issues with it. This is the thing that caused my Word document to crash. I don't know why. And it was weird too, because sometimes it would return a record, sometimes it didn't. And there was nothing different. It literally was, I just ran it once, that time worked fine, this time didn't. So I will show you those. For example, I'm going to search for the last name Reed in the last name field. So I know it's there because we can clearly see it inside of there. This particular method will return true or false. So if it is found, it returns true. If it is not found, it returns false. So if you wrap this in an if statement, and you can say, hey, if it's found, do something, right? So we'll say debug print the last name Reed was found. I'm hoping it returned something. Okay, so that worked fine. I'm going to try Alex this time. This should be in the first name. I'm hoping it works. that didn't work. So you can see here that it should. There doesn't seem to be any issues with it. The other thing that's interesting is there's no spaces in that one, but then if you loop through them, and you'll see in a second, it has an underscore. So I would say don't rely on this method. It seems to be very buggy. So for just the time being, I'm going to comment that out. Like I said before, it seems to work sometimes, other times it doesn't seem to work. But more importantly, it has caused my Word document to crash. So I would say be careful when you use that. And I would basically say just rule it out for the time being. Okay, so next we're going to loop through each data field. So this is like we're looping through each row in our data source, if that's how you kind of want to think about it. Again, this is just more printing out some information. So I'm just going to take some code I already have pre-written, and we'll discuss basically what's inside of it. Ooh. Okay. So the first thing that we need to recognize is that if we go into our data source object, there is a data fields property. The data fields property returns the data fields collection. This is all the data fields that exist in our data source. And then all we're simply doing is we're going to use a for each loop to loop through each of the data fields. So you can see here that I'm simply taking my object that I defined up here, and I'm looping through it. Now, technically, if I was being very specific, I would set the data fields. And I would say set, what is it? Word mail merge fields equals word mail merge data source data fields. And then I would copy this and then paste it right over there. Now, when you loop through each mail merge field, there's not a ton of properties with them. In this particular example, each one has an index, so the particular row index. You have a name, so what is the field name? You also have that field value. So this is basically like the column name, and then this is like the actual column value, so the actual like row value inside of that column. And then you have parent. We've talked about that in previous videos. That's just the object that's above it. And then you also have the creator and application. That's really irrelevant for most of this particular example. So what we're going to do is, again, just for some readability purposes, I'm going to actually comment this out, and we're going to loop through each field. Now, I do want to note here, you can see that's the first one, second one, third one, invoice, and amount. Now, it doesn't loop through each actual row. It does loop through each of the fields on the current selected row. So you notice how here we're on that third row. So it's basically looping through this particular row. So all this is doing is it's kind of a little bit deceiving. You would think that if I can open, God, why can I not open it? You would think it's looping through each record. It's not. It's looping through each field in the specified record that we are on. The record that we're on, not all the records. So just be aware of that. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the field names. So this is very similar to the data fields, but now we're just working with the specific field names. And just like the previous example, I want to be a little bit consistent and show you how you would grab that collection. I'm going to copy this, field names. Okay, perfect. Still in the data source, but you'll notice here there are field names, just like that. Okay. And then I'm going to just clean this up a little bit. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste over that. Just a little bit of cleaning up. And then finally, I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to clear that. And then you can see here the index. And then these are the field names in our data source. I can't remember if I said this I just said it a few minutes ago. I don't know if I said if this was the row number or not. This is not the row number. This is the field number. So like counting, like, okay, I'm going left to right. What is that field number? So basically, like, I guess that's, or maybe it is. Let me double check. I can't remember what I was saying now. I think it's, yeah, it's the field index. The field index. So this is like, what column number am I on? So it's very similar to what we're seeing down here. This one is just simply returning the field name, so the actual name. Now, like the previous one, there's really not a lot you can do with it. It's just kind of there. It's more for information purposes. You're not necessarily changing a lot about it. I think these are read only. Let's take a look. So this is only read only. So you can't actually set the value. So again, just for future purposes, usually if it says read only, that's it. It means you can read it. It doesn't mean you can write it. It doesn't mean you can actually change that value. Now, with that though, that actually does it for at least working with our data source. Again, it was really just kind of more talking about, hey, we have a data source. How do we kind of take information from it and maybe get some additional context, or if we need to do things that might depend on how many rows there are or how many records there are, things along that particular index. That is the information you can get from our data source. We might play a little bit more with it when it comes to actually walking through, hey, we have a data source. We're going to start creating a template and putting some information in there. We'll start talking a little bit more about maybe some stuff we can do with that data source, but we'll reserve that for that particular video. At this point, I'm going to cut off the video. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we will see you in video number 3.